Sometimes the worst day of your life becomes the doorway to everything you never knew you needed. When Sarah Mitchell's world collapsed in a single afternoon, she had no idea that her tears would lead her to a dusty ranch road where a stranger's kindness would change everything. This is the true story of how a woman who had lost faith and love found herself in the gentle hands of a cowboy who saw her worth when she couldn't see it herself. It's about second chances, healing hearts, and discovering that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what was meant to be yours all along. Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway of what used to be her apartment, staring at the empty space where her life had been just hours before. The movers had finished loading David's belongings into the truck, taking with them not just furniture and clothes, but 5 years of shared memories, dreams, and what she had foolishly believed was forever. The echo of her footsteps on the hardwood floor seemed to mock her as she walked through rooms that now felt like a museum of her own failures. The letter was still crumpled in her hand, the one David had left on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker they had bought together last Christmas. His handwriting, once familiar and comforting, now felt like knife cuts across the paper. He had found someone else, someone who understood his ambitions better, someone who wouldn't hold him back from his career goals. The words blurred as fresh tears filled her eyes, but she had read them so many times in the past 6 hours that they were burned into her memory. She sank onto the single remaining chair, a rickety wooden thing that David had deemed unworthy of his new life. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of traffic from the street below and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Her phone buzzed on the floor where she had thrown it earlier, probably another well-meaning friend offering sympathy she wasn't ready to accept. The thought of explaining what had happened, of seeing the pity in their eyes, made her stomach turn. The apartment felt like a tomb now, filled with ghosts of laughter that would never return and plans that would never be fulfilled. The walls seemed to be closing in, suffocating her with memories of birthday mornings in bed, quiet Sunday afternoons reading together, and countless evenings planning a future that had turned out to be nothing more than an illusion. She could still smell his cologne in the air, a cruel reminder of how quickly someone could become a stranger. Her job at the marketing firm had been suffering for weeks as David grew more distant and critical. Her boss had already mentioned her declining performance, and now she wondered how she would even face going back tomorrow. Everything felt connected to him, tainted by his absence and the realization that she had slowly lost herself somewhere along the way, becoming someone she barely recognized in the mirror. The bank account was another source of panic. David had handled most of their finances, and now she was left to figure out how to afford rent on her salary alone. The lease was in both their names, but she knew he wouldn't be coming back to help with anything. The independence she had once prided herself on seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a dependence that now left her feeling utterly lost and vulnerable. As the sun began to set outside her window, painting the empty apartment in shades of orange and gold, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. She couldn't stay here, surrounded by the remnants of a life that no longer existed. She needed to get away, to go somewhere where she could think clearly without every corner reminding her of what she had lost. Her grandmother's old house in Montana had been sitting empty since she passed away 2 years ago, left to Sarah in the will but never visited due to David's complaints about small-town life. The idea grew stronger as she thought about it. The house was fully furnished, sitting on 20 acres outside a town called Cedar Ridge, population barely 3,000. It was the opposite of everything David had wanted, which suddenly made it exactly what she needed. She had enough savings for gas and food for a few weeks, and maybe some time away from the city would help her figure out what came next. With newfound determination, Sarah began throwing clothes into a suitcase, not bothering to fold anything carefully. She packed photo albums from before David, books he had always criticized as impractical, and the few personal items that truly belonged to her alone. Each item felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been slowly eroded over the years. She found her grandmother's letters, tied with a faded ribbon, and held them close to her chest for a moment before adding them to the pile. The drive would take her through 3 states, but the thought of endless highway and changing scenery appealed to her more than staying in this hollow shell of an apartment. She had always loved road trips as a child, before life became complicated by careers and relationships and all the things adults were supposed to prioritize. Maybe there was something healing about returning to that simple pleasure of movement and possibility. As she loaded her car in the parking garage, Sarah caught her reflection in the side mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her hair was messy, her eyes red and swollen, her face pale with exhaustion and shock. But, beneath all that, there was something else, something that looked almost like determination. She had hit rock bottom, but that meant the only direction left was up. The city lights blurred past her windows as she drove through downtown, each familiar landmark feeling like a goodbye. The restaurant where David had proposed, the park where they used to walk on Sundays, the movie theater where they had spent countless Friday nights. All of it belonged to a different person now, someone who had believed in happy endings and forever promises. That woman was gone, but maybe whoever she was becoming would be stronger. The highway stretched out ahead of her, dark and endless under the star-filled sky. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she could breathe deeply. Each mile put more distance between her and the pain, between her and the person she had been trying so hard to be for someone else. The radio played old country songs that her grandmother used to love, and, despite everything, Sarah found herself humming along. She drove through the night, stopping only for gas and coffee, watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to farmland to something wild and beautiful. The mountains appeared on the horizon as dawn broke, their peaks catching the first light and promising something new. Her hands were steady on the wheel, her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. Whatever was waiting for her in Montana, it had to be better than the emptiness she was leaving behind. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold, Sarah Mitchell drove toward an uncertain future with nothing but hope and a stubborn refusal to let one man's rejection define the rest of her story. She didn't know it yet, but she was driving toward the best chapter of her life, toward a love that would heal every broken place in her heart and show her what she was truly worth. The old Honda started making strange noises somewhere outside Billings, a grinding sound that made Sarah's already anxious heart skip a beat. She had been driving for nearly 18 hours, stopping only for brief naps at rest stops when exhaustion threatened to overtake her determination. The morning sun was climbing high over the Montana landscape, revealing rolling hills dotted with cattle and vast stretches of grass that seemed to go on forever. When the car finally gave up, it did so with dramatic flair, steam billowing from under the hood as Sarah coasted to a stop on the shoulder of a two-lane highway. She sat in the sudden silence for a moment, listening to the tick and hiss of the cooling engine, before the reality of her situation hit her. She was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell phone service and no idea how far she was from the nearest town. The heat was already building despite the early hour, and Sarah realized she had only half a bottle of water left. Her phone showed no bars, just the mocking words "no service" where her lifeline to the world should have been. She popped the hood and stared at the smoking engine, knowing absolutely nothing about cars beyond how to pump gas and check the oil. The sight of various hoses and belts meant nothing to her, and the acrid smell of antifreeze made her step back. A sense of panic began to creep in as the reality of her situation settled over her. Here she was, running away from her problems, and now she was literally stuck in the middle of nowhere with no way forward and no way back. The irony wasn't lost on her that David had always insisted on handling car maintenance, another area where she had allowed herself to become dependent. Now that independence was costing her dearly. She tried walking back down the road to see if she could spot any signs of civilization, but the highway stretched empty in both directions, with nothing but fence posts and grazing cattle as far as the eye could see. The silence was absolute except for the wind through the grass and the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, this vast emptiness that made her feel incredibly small and alone. Back at the car, Sarah sat on the tailgate and tried not to cry. She had used up most of her tears in the past 24 hours, but the frustration and fear threatened to bring on a fresh wave. Everything felt like too much, too overwhelming, like the universe was conspiring against her at every turn. Maybe David was right about her being impractical and unable to handle real-world challenges. Maybe she was foolish to think she could just run away and start over. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became oppressive. Sarah moved to the shade on the passenger side of the car, rationing her water and trying to think clearly about her options. She could wait for someone to drive by, though traffic seemed sparse on this stretch of road. She could try walking, though she had no idea how far the nearest town might be. Or she could just sit here and accept that her attempt at independence had failed spectacularly. As the morning stretched into afternoon, only 2 vehicles had passed, both traveling too fast to notice her stranded car. Sarah was beginning to feel genuinely scared when she heard the sound of an engine approaching from the south. This one was moving slower, and she stood up hopefully as a dusty pickup truck came into view. It was an older model, dark blue with a dented tailgate, and it was definitely slowing down. The truck pulled over about 20 yards ahead of her car, and Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as the driver's door opened. A tall man in a cowboy hat climbed out, moving with the unhurried grace of someone accustomed to wide open spaces. He was wearing faded jeans, work boots, and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and even from a distance, Sarah could see the concern on his weathered face. He approached slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening, clearly aware that a stranded woman might be nervous about a stranger. When he was close enough to speak without shouting, he touched the brim of his hat in greeting and said, "Ma'am, looks like you're having some car trouble. I'm Jake Thornton. Is there anything I can do to help?" His voice was deep and calm, with the kind of accent that spoke of generations spent in ranch country. There was something immediately trustworthy about him, from his steady gaze to the respectful distance he maintained. Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she realized that help had finally arrived. "I'm Sarah," she said, surprised by how hoarse her voice sounded. The engine just started making noise and then it died. "I don't know anything about cars, and my phone has no signal out here." Jake nodded sympathetically and asked if she minded if he took a look under the hood. His manner was professional but kind, and Sarah found herself trusting this stranger more than she had trusted anyone in a long time. She watched as he examined the engine, his movements confident and knowledgeable. He tested various components, checked fluid levels, and, finally, straightened up with a slight frown. "Looks like your radiator's had it," he said, wiping his hands on a rag from his back pocket. "The good news is it's fixable. The bad news is you're about 30 miles from the nearest garage, and this car isn't going anywhere under its own power." The news should have been devastating, but something about Jake's calm competence made it feel manageable. He explained that he could tow her car to town with his truck, and that Murphy's garage was honest and reliable. The mechanic was also his neighbor, so Jake could put in a word to make sure Sarah was treated fairly. "I hate to be a bother," Sarah began, but Jake cut her off with a gentle smile. "No bother at all," he said. "This is ranch country. We look out for each other out here, and that includes folks just passing through. Let me hook up the tow strap, and we'll have you sorted out in no time." As Jake worked to secure her car to his truck, Sarah found herself watching his movements with something approaching fascination. There was an economy to his actions, no wasted motion, everything done with quiet competence. His hands were large and capable, scarred from years of ranch work, but gentle as he handled her car with obvious care for her belongings inside. The ride to town in Jake's truck was awkward at first, two strangers thrown together by circumstance. But Jake had an easy way of talking that gradually put Sarah at ease. He pointed out landmarks along the way, told her a bit about the area's history, and asked gentle questions about where she was headed without prying into her obvious distress. Cedar Ridge turned out to be exactly the kind of small town Sarah remembered from childhood visits to her grandmother. Main Street was lined with old brick buildings housing a few essential businesses. There were American flags hanging from several porches, and everyone they passed waved at Jake's truck. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where strangers were noticed and helped, where life moved at a pace that allowed for conversation and consideration. Murphy's garage was at the end of Main Street, a weathered building with two service bays and a small office that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. Frank Murphy turned out to be a grizzled man in his 60s who took one look at Sarah's car and immediately understood the situation. Jake's introduction carried weight here, and Sarah could see the difference it made in how she was treated. "Jake's bringing you means you're good people," Frank said simply. "Let me take a look at this radiator, and we'll get you back on the road." While Frank examined the car, Jake offered to drive Sarah to the diner for lunch, explaining that repairs would take a few hours at minimum. She accepted gratefully, realizing she hadn't eaten anything substantial since leaving the city. The simple kindness of this stranger was almost overwhelming after the emotional brutality of the past day. The Cedar Ridge Diner was exactly what Sarah expected, with red vinyl booths, a long counter with chrome stools, and the smell of hamburgers and fresh coffee filling the air. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Dolly, greeted Jake like family and sized up Sarah with the keen eye of someone who had seen every type of traveler pass through over the years. Over comfort food and strong coffee, Sarah found herself opening up to Jake in a way that surprised her. Maybe it was his easy manner, or maybe she was just desperate to talk to someone who didn't know her history, but she told him about her grandmother's house and her plans to stay there for a while. She didn't mention David or the breakup, but something in her voice must have conveyed her emotional state because Jake's eyes filled with understanding. "Your grandmother's place," Jake said thoughtfully. "That wouldn't be the old Morrison house out on Willow Creek Road, would it?" Sarah nodded, surprised. "You knew my grandmother?" Jake's smile was warm and genuine. "Elena Morrison was a remarkable woman. She helped my family through some tough times when I was a kid. That house has been sitting empty too long. Elena would be happy to know family is coming back to it." The afternoon stretched on as they waited for the car repairs, and Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks. Jake was easy to talk to, with stories about ranch life and the characters who populated Cedar Ridge. He didn't push for personal information, but his presence was comforting in a way Sarah hadn't experienced in years. When Frank finally called to say the repairs were complete, Sarah felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. This interlude with Jake had been a bright spot in what had been the darkest period of her life, and she wasn't ready for it to end. As they walked back to the garage together, she tried to think of a way to express her gratitude without seeming forward or needy. The bill from Frank was surprisingly reasonable, and Sarah paid it with relief, grateful that her emergency fund could cover this unexpected expense. As she prepared to continue her journey to the house, Jake handed her a piece of paper with his phone number written in neat handwriting. "In case you need anything while you're settling in," he said. "That house has been empty for a while, and old places can be temperamental. Don't hesitate to call if you run into any problems." As Sarah drove the final 20 miles to her grandmother's house, she found herself thinking not about David or her ruined life, but about Jake Thornton's kind eyes and gentle manner. For the first time since her world had fallen apart, she felt a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. The Morrison house sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through cottonwood trees and across a small creek, exactly as Sarah remembered from childhood visits. The two-story farmhouse looked smaller than in her memories, but it was still charming with its wraparound porch and gabled roof. Wild roses had taken over much of the front yard, their sweet scent filling the evening air as Sarah parked her newly repaired car next to the front steps. The key was exactly where her grandmother had always kept it, under the third loose board on the porch, and the door opened with the same familiar squeak that had announced visitors for decades. Inside, dust motes danced in the late afternoon sunlight that streamed through lace curtains, and everything was exactly as Elena Morrison had left it. The furniture was covered with white sheets, giving the rooms a ghostly appearance, but underneath Sarah could see the familiar shapes of her childhood. Walking through the house was like stepping back in time. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon and vanilla, scents that had perfumed countless batches of her grandmother's famous sugar cookies. The living room held the same overstuffed furniture, the same family photos on the mantel, the same sense of warmth and welcome that had made this place a refuge during every difficult period of Sarah's childhood. Her grandmother's bedroom was on the ground floor, but Sarah chose to take her old room upstairs, the one with the slanted ceiling and the window that looked out over the pasture where horses used to graze. The room was exactly as she had left it during her last visit at age 16, complete with faded floral wallpaper and a narrow bed covered with one of her grandmother's handmade quilts. That first night, Sarah sat on the front porch with a cup of tea and listened to sounds she had forgotten existed. Crickets chirped in the grass, somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, and the wind rustled through the leaves of the old oak tree that had shaded the house for generations. The silence was profound after years of city noise, but it wasn't empty. It was full of peace and possibility. The next few days fell into a natural rhythm. Sarah spent her mornings cleaning and airing out the house, rediscovering treasures from her childhood and mementos of her grandmother's long life. She found boxes of letters from her grandfather during the war, photo albums documenting decades of family history, and recipes written in her grandmother's careful handwriting. Each discovery felt like a gift, a connection to a simpler time when love was measured in daily kindnesses rather than grand gestures. The afternoons were for exploring the property, walking the 20 acres that surrounded the house and remembering why she had always felt so at peace here. There was a small barn that housed her grandmother's old gardening tools, a chicken coop that stood empty but intact, and a vegetable garden that had returned to wilderness but still showed signs of careful planning. On the third day, while she was trying to fix a broken fence post near the road, a familiar pickup truck slowed down and turned into her driveway. Jake Thornton climbed out with a toolbox in one hand and a casserole dish in the other, his easy smile immediately brightening Sarah's day. "Thought you might need some help getting settled," he said, setting the casserole on the porch steps. "And Dolly at the diner insisted I bring you some of her famous beef stew. She says a woman can't survive on tea and whatever she can find in an empty pantry." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the Montana sunshine. She had been dreading the approaching evening, when the loneliness always seemed to hit hardest, but Jake's presence chased away the shadows before they could gather. She accepted his help gratefully, watching as he expertly repaired the fence post and several other small problems she had been struggling with. Working alongside Jake felt natural and comfortable in a way that surprised Sarah. He didn't dominate the work or make her feel incompetent, but instead showed her how to do things and praised her efforts when she succeeded. His teaching style was patient and encouraging, so different from David's tendency to simply take over whenever she struggled with something. As they worked, they talked about everything and nothing. Jake told her stories about growing up on his family's ranch, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about summers spent helping with roundups and winters spent mending equipment. Sarah found herself sharing memories of her grandmother, of summers spent learning to garden and can vegetables, of the sense of belonging she had always felt in this place. When Jake mentioned that his ranch bordered her property on the south side, Sarah felt a little thrill of pleasure. It meant he was a neighbor, not just a good Samaritan who would disappear once her immediate needs were met. The thought of having him nearby made the isolation feel less daunting and more like an adventure. Over the following weeks, Jake became a regular visitor, always arriving with a legitimate excuse for stopping by. Sometimes he brought fresh eggs from his chickens, sometimes he offered to help with a repair project, and sometimes he just happened to be checking on cattle in the pasture next to hers. Sarah began to look forward to these visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and worried her. The worry came from how quickly she was coming to depend on Jake's presence in her day. After years of being told she was too needy, too emotional, too much work, she was terrified of falling into the same patterns that had destroyed her relationship with David. But Jake never seemed annoyed by her questions or impatient with her learning curve. Instead, he appeared to genuinely enjoy teaching her about ranch life and listening to her thoughts about everything from books to philosophy. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jake asked quietly about what had brought her to Montana. Sarah had been dreading this conversation, but found that the words came easier than expected. She told him about David, about the breakup, about feeling lost and directionless in her old life. Jake listened without judgment, his face reflecting understanding rather than pity. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said simply. "But I'm grateful it brought you here. This place needs someone who understands its value, and you clearly do." His response was so different from what Sarah had expected that she felt tears prick her eyes. There was no attempt to fix her or analyze what had gone wrong, no suggestion that she should have tried harder or done things differently. Just acceptance and a quiet affirmation that her presence was wanted and valued. As summer deepened, Sarah began to feel like herself again for the first time in years. The daily rhythm of ranch life suited her in ways she hadn't expected. She learned to tend chickens, which Jake had helped her acquire, and to maintain a vegetable garden that was beginning to produce fresh tomatoes and beans. The physical work was satisfying in a way her desk job had never been, and the immediate results gave her a sense of accomplishment that had been missing from her life. She also began to rediscover her love of reading, spending long evenings on the porch with books from her grandmother's extensive library. Jake often joined her, bringing his own book or simply enjoying the peaceful silence. Sometimes they would discuss what they were reading, and Sarah was surprised to discover that the quiet cowboy was well-read and thoughtful, with insights that challenged her thinking and made her see familiar stories in new ways. The transformation wasn't just emotional but physical as well. The outdoor work and country air had given Sarah a healthy glow, and she found herself sleeping better than she had in years. Her hair had grown longer and lighter from the sun, and she had traded her city clothes for practical jeans and boots that were more suited to her new lifestyle. One morning, while feeding the chickens, Sarah realized with a start that she hadn't thought about David in over a week. The constant ache that had accompanied her to Montana was gone, replaced by a sense of contentment and anticipation for each new day. She was beginning to understand what her grandmother had always known, that this place had a healing power that went beyond simple rest and relaxation. The healing wasn't complete yet, and Sarah still had moments of doubt and sadness. But, increasingly, those moments were balanced by genuine happiness and a growing sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The broken woman who had fled the city was slowly being replaced by someone stronger and more authentic, someone who could appreciate simple pleasures and find joy in ordinary moments. When Jake stopped by that afternoon with fresh corn from his garden, Sarah greeted him with a smile that felt completely natural. They worked together to prepare and freeze the corn, their movements synchronized and comfortable, their conversation easy and punctuated by laughter. As they worked, Sarah caught Jake watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something warm and wondering that made her heart skip a beat. That evening, as they sat on the porch sharing a simple dinner of corn and fresh bread, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. 6 weeks ago, she had been broken and desperate, convinced that her life was over. Now, surrounded by the beauty of Montana and warmed by Jake's steady presence, she was beginning to believe that sometimes the best chapters of your life begin exactly when you think the story is ending. The future was still uncertain, and Sarah had no idea what would happen when summer ended and reality intruded on this pastoral interlude. But, for the first time in years, she wasn't worried about the future. She was too busy living in the present, discovering who she was when she wasn't trying to be someone else, and allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved the kind of love that asked nothing of her except to be herself. August arrived with a heat that seemed to rise from the earth itself, shimmering off the pastures and making the work of maintaining the property both more challenging and more rewarding. Sarah had fallen into a routine that felt as natural as breathing, rising with the sun to tend her chickens and garden before the heat became oppressive, then spending the cooler evening hours on projects around the house. Jake's visits had become daily occurrences, though neither of them acknowledged the shift from helpful neighbor to something deeper. He would arrive each morning with coffee from town and some excuse for staying, whether it was checking on her new irrigation system or helping her learn to preserve the abundance from her garden. Sarah had stopped pretending she didn't look forward to seeing his truck turn down her driveway, and she had noticed that Jake always seemed to have more work to do on her side of the property line than his own. The morning that changed everything started like any other, with Jake arriving as Sarah was collecting eggs from the chicken coop. But, instead of his usual easy smile, his face was creased with worry, and he was moving faster than his typical unhurried pace. When he reached her, she could see genuine concern in his eyes. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "There's a wildfire started up north of here, and the wind's pushing it this way. The sheriff's department is talking about evacuations for this whole area." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she looked toward the northern horizon, where a column of smoke was indeed visible against the blue sky. The thought of losing her grandmother's house, this place that had become her sanctuary, filled her with a panic that surprised her with its intensity. This was no longer just a temporary refuge, it had become home in a way nowhere else ever had. Jake must have seen the fear in her eyes because his expression softened slightly. "Hey," he said gently, "we're going to take care of this. I've got livestock to move and some preparations to make at my place, but I'll help you get everything ready here first. The fire's still a ways off, but we need to be smart about this." The next few hours were a blur of activity as Jake helped Sarah prepare for a possible evacuation. They moved her most precious belongings, including her grandmother's photo albums and quilts, to her car. They soaked the area around the house with water from the well and cleared brush from around the buildings. Through it all, Jake's calm competence kept Sarah from falling apart completely. But, as the day wore on and the smoke grew thicker, it became clear that the fire was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. The sheriff's department issued a mandatory evacuation order for their area, giving residents 2 hours to gather essentials and leave. Sarah stood in her grandmother's kitchen, trying to decide what else to take, when the magnitude of possibly losing everything hit her like a physical blow. She sank onto a kitchen chair and began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond grief. This house represented everything she had gained since leaving the city: her independence, her peace, her growing sense of self-worth. The thought of watching it burn was unbearable, but even worse was the realization that she would have to leave Jake, return to a life that no longer fit her, go back to being the person she had been before she learned who she really was. Jake found her there, hunched over the kitchen table with tears streaming down her face. Without a word, he pulled up a chair beside her and gathered her into his arms, holding her while she sobbed against his chest. His shirt grew damp with her tears, but he didn't seem to mind, just stroked her hair and murmured quiet words of comfort. "I can't lose this place," Sarah whispered against his shoulder. "I can't lose what I've found here." "You won't lose it," Jake said firmly, pulling back to look into her eyes. "Even if the house burns, what you found here isn't in the buildings, Sarah. It's in you. You've become who you were always meant to be, and that can't be taken away by any fire." His words, spoken with such conviction and tenderness, pierced through Sarah's panic and reached something deep inside her. She looked into his face, really looked at him for the first time since he had become such a central part of her daily life, and saw something there that took her breath away. This wasn't just neighborly concern or casual affection. This was love, deep and sure and patient, written in every line of his weathered face. "Jake," she whispered, and something in her voice must have told him that she finally understood what had been growing between them all summer, because his eyes grew tender and he cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, Sarah," he said simply. "I've loved you since that first day when you were trying so hard to be brave beside your broken-down car. I love your determination and your kindness and the way you've embraced this life that's so different from what you knew before. And I'll love you whether this house survives the night or not." The kiss that followed was like coming home after a lifetime of being lost. It was gentle and sure, full of promise and hope and all the feelings that had been building between them through weeks of shared work and quiet conversations. When they finally broke apart, Sarah felt like everything had changed and nothing had changed all at once, as if this moment had been inevitable from the very beginning. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips, the words feeling both new and ancient, like something she had always known but never dared to say. "I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you stopped to help me, but I was too scared to admit it, even to myself." They might have stayed there forever, lost in the wonder of finally acknowledging what had been growing between them, but the sharp sound of a car horn from the driveway reminded them of the approaching danger. Through the kitchen window, they could see a sheriff's deputy's vehicle, and they knew their time was up. The evacuation convoy was a sobering sight, a line of vehicles loaded with belongings and livestock trailers carrying animals to safety. Sarah's car was packed with her most precious possessions, but she found herself looking back at the house with a surprising sense of peace. Win or lose, fire or no fire, she was not the same woman who had arrived here broken and desperate. She was someone who could handle whatever came next. Jake had arranged for them to take his animals and hers to a friend's ranch 50 miles south, outside the fire's projected path. The drive was tense, with constant radio updates about the fire's progress and the brave efforts of the firefighters working to contain it. But even in the midst of crisis, Sarah was aware of Jake's presence beside her in the convoy, his steady reliability and anchor in the chaos. The evacuation center was set up in the high school gymnasium of a nearby town, filled with cots and Red Cross volunteers and the subdued conversations of people who didn't know if they would have homes to return to. Sarah and Jake found themselves sitting together on folding chairs, her hand in his, watching the news coverage of the fire that threatened everything they cared about. As the hours passed and the reports continued, other evacuees began to share their stories. Many had been through fires before, and they spoke with the resigned wisdom of people who understood the unpredictable nature of such disasters. Some would lose everything, they acknowledged, but they would rebuild. That was what you did in ranch country, you faced what came and you rebuilt. Sarah listened to these conversations with growing amazement at the strength and resilience of the people around her. These weren't wealthy folks with insurance policies that would make them whole again. These were working people, ranchers and farmers and small business owners who might lose the work of generations in a single night. Yet there was no despair in their voices, only a quiet determination to face whatever came next. Sometime after midnight, when Sarah was dozing fitfully against Jake's shoulder, a cheer went up from the group gathered around the television. The wind had shifted, pushing the fire away from their area and toward open rangeland where it could be more easily controlled. While the danger wasn't completely over, the immediate threat to their homes had passed. The relief was overwhelming, but as Sarah felt the tension drain from her body, she realized that something fundamental had changed during those hours of uncertainty. Facing the possibility of loss had clarified what truly mattered to her, and it wasn't the house or the land or any material possession. It was this feeling of belonging, of being valued for exactly who she was, of having found her place in the world. More than that, it was Jake, whose love had been offered without conditions or expectations, who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. The fire had forced her to admit what her heart had been telling her for weeks: she was in love with this quiet, steady man who had shown her what real love looked like through simple daily kindnesses and unwavering support. The drive back home the next morning was like a celebration, with neighbors calling out greetings and updates as the convoy wound its way back through the fire-touched landscape. There had been losses, properties burned and livestock killed, but their section had been spared. The house stood exactly as they had left it, surrounded by the roses that still perfumed the morning air. As Sarah stepped onto her grandmother's porch, she felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. This place had given her back herself, had shown her what she was capable of when she stopped trying to be someone else. But, more than that, it had brought her Jake, whose love was already teaching her that the best was yet to come. Standing there in the morning light, with Jake's hand warm in hers and the promise of a future she could barely imagine stretching out before her, Sarah finally understood what her grandmother had always known. Home wasn't a place you found, it was something you built, day by day, with the people who saw your true worth and loved you anyway. And she was finally ready to build something beautiful. The weeks following the fire brought a new dimension to Sarah and Jake's relationship, one that felt both natural and revolutionary after her experience with David. Where her previous relationship had been built on compromise and adaptation, constantly molding herself to fit someone else's expectations, this love grew from mutual respect and genuine compatibility. Jake loved her exactly as she was, and she found herself loving not just him but the woman she became when she was with him. September arrived with the kind of golden light that photographers dream about, painting the Montana landscape in shades of amber and rust. Sarah's garden was producing its final harvest, and she spent her mornings preserving vegetables and learning the domestic arts her grandmother had tried to teach her years ago. Jake often worked alongside her, peeling apples for canning or helping her learn to smoke the fish they caught in Willow Creek. These domestic scenes felt like playing house, except they were real and substantial and building toward something permanent. Sarah had called her boss to request an extended leave of absence, citing family obligations, but privately she knew she was never going back to her old life. The marketing firm belonged to a different person, someone who had measured success by salary and approval ratings rather than the satisfaction of work well done and relationships built on truth. The question of the future hung unspoken between them for weeks, both of them seeming to sense that addressing it directly might somehow break the spell of their perfect autumn idyll. Sarah knew she couldn't stay in her grandmother's house indefinitely without making some kind of decision about her life, and Jake's careful avoidance of the topic suggested he was wrestling with the same concerns about pushing too hard too fast. The conversation that changed everything happened on a crisp October morning when they were repairing a section of fence that bordered both their properties. Sarah had become competent with ranch work over the summer, and she took pride in Jake's obvious approval of her growing skills. As they worked, he mentioned casually that the property next to his was going up for sale, a small ranch with good water rights and a house that needed work but had good bones. "It's the kind of place someone could build a real life," he said, not looking at her directly. "Enough land for horses and cattle, close enough to town for convenience but far enough out for privacy. The kind of property that doesn't come on the market very often." Sarah felt her heart skip as she realized what he was really saying. This wasn't just ranch gossip, it was an invitation, carefully phrased to give her room to retreat if she wasn't ready. She set down her tools and looked at him directly, seeing the vulnerability he was trying to hide behind practical observations. "Jake," she said quietly, "are you asking me to stay? Not just for the winter, but really stay?" He turned to face her then, his expression serious and hopeful at the same time. "I'm asking if you think you could be happy here permanently." I'm asking if what we have is something you'd want to build a real future on. I'm asking if you love me enough to take a chance on a life that's nothing like what you had planned. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Sarah thought about her old life, about the apartment that had felt like a prison and the job that had drained her spirit and the man who had loved her only as long as she remained useful to his ambitions. Then, she looked at Jake, whose love had asked nothing of her except honesty, whose presence had healed wounds she hadn't even known she was carrying. Yes, she said simply, and the word seemed to ring in the clear morning air like a bell. Yes to all of it. Yes to staying, yes to building something together, yes to taking chances on love. The kiss that followed was different from their first one during the fire evacuation. That had been about recognition and confession, this was about commitment and choice. When they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing with the giddy relief of people who had taken a leap of faith and found solid ground on the other side. The practical arrangements happened quickly once the emotional decision was made. Sarah gave her formal resignation to the marketing firm, sold her apartment and most of her belongings, and used the proceeds as a down payment on the ranch Jake had mentioned. Her grandmother's house would remain in the family, used as a guest house and retreat, but Sarah's real home would be the property she would build with Jake. The wedding took place on a snowy December day in the little church where Jake's family had worshipped for 3 generations. Sarah had worried about not having family present, but she needn't have concerned herself. The entire community had adopted her as one of their own, and the church was filled with the faces of people who had watched her transformation from broken city girl to confident rancher's wife. She wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit but still carrying the weight of family history and enduring love. Jake wore his grandfather's bolo tie with his new suit, and when he saw Sarah walking down the aisle, his face lit up with such pure joy that several people in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The vows they exchanged were traditional in words but revolutionary in meaning, at least for Sarah. When she promised to love and honor and cherish, she meant it with a depth of conviction that surprised her. This wasn't the desperate clinging of someone afraid to be alone, this was the confident choice of a woman who knew her own worth and was freely giving her heart to someone who treasured it. The reception in the church basement was exactly what Sarah had come to expect from this community, generous, warm, and filled with the kind of simple pleasures that created lasting memories. There was homemade food and a local band and dancing that went on until the early hours of the morning. Sarah danced with Jake and his father and several of the older men who had known her grandmother, feeling embraced by a tradition of celebration that stretched back generations. But the moment that would stay with her forever came late in the evening, when she was sitting at a table catching her breath between dances and watching Jake talk with his cousins across the room. Dolly from the diner sat down beside her, a plate of wedding cake in her weathered hands. "You know," Dolly said quietly, "I've been watching that boy pine for you since the day he brought you to my diner looking like a lost soul. I've never seen him so happy as he's been these past few months, and I've known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at this woman who had become like a surrogate mother to her. "I never thought I could be this happy," she admitted. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Now I feel like it's just beginning." Dolly patted her hand with the casual affection of a woman who had seen many young brides and knew the difference between infatuation and real love. "That's because you finally found where you belong, honey. Some people spend their whole lives looking for that, and some lucky ones have it handed to them by a broken-down car and a cowboy with a good heart." The first year of marriage brought challenges that tested both of them in ways they hadn't anticipated. Learning to merge 2 lives, 2 sets of habits, 2 ways of approaching everything from money to chores to dealing with conflict required patience and compromise from both sides. Sarah had to learn that Jake's quietness during disagreements didn't mean withdrawal but reflection, and Jake had to understand that Sarah's need to talk through problems wasn't criticism but processing. But they approached these challenges as partners, working together to build something stronger than either of them could create alone. When Sarah struggled with the isolation of ranch life during the long winter months, Jake arranged for her to teach reading at the local elementary school, giving her the social contact she craved while contributing to the community. When Jake worried about the financial pressures of expanding their operation, Sarah used her business background to help him develop a more systematic approach to marketing their cattle. Spring brought the first serious test of their partnership when Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mixture of joy and terror, remembering how David had reacted when she had brought up the possibility of children. But Jake's response was everything David's had not been: immediate, uncomplicated delight followed by tender concern for her health and well-being. "Are you happy?" she asked him that evening as they sat on the porch of their new house, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Jake said, pulling her closer against his side. "You've given me everything I never dared to hope for. A partner who loves this life as much as I do, a home filled with laughter and purpose, and now a baby to love and raise together. I feel like the luckiest man alive." The baby was born on a crisp October morning exactly a year after their engagement, a daughter with Sarah's dark hair and Jake's steady gaze. They named her Elena, for the grandmother whose house had started it all, and, as Sarah held her newborn daughter for the first time, she felt the final piece of her new life click into place. Looking back, Sarah could trace the thread that connected her lowest moment to her highest joy, seeing how every seemingly random event had led her exactly where she needed to be. The heartbreak that had driven her from the city, the car trouble that had stranded her on a Montana highway, even the fire that had forced her to acknowledge her true feelings, all of it had been necessary to bring her to this moment. As she nursed Elena on the porch of the house she and Jake had built together, watching him work with their horses in the pasture beyond the garden, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her home. She had learned that sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover what you actually need. That real love doesn't ask you to be different but helps you become who you were always meant to be. The marketing executive who had fled the city in tears seemed like a stranger now, someone Sarah could barely remember being. That woman had measured her worth by external validation and defined love as a constant negotiation of needs and compromises. This woman, wife and mother and partner in every sense of the word, knew that love was something you built together day by day through countless small acts of kindness and consideration. When people asked her how she had known Jake was the one, Sarah always struggled to explain it adequately. It wasn't that he had rescued her, though his kindness had certainly been a lifeline when she needed it most. It was that he had seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself, had believed in her strength when she felt completely powerless, had loved her not despite her brokenness but through it to the wholeness that lay waiting on the other side. As the sun set behind the mountains and Elena fell asleep in her arms, Sarah whispered a prayer of thanksgiving for broken-down cars and helpful strangers and the kind of love that asks nothing more than the chance to grow. She had been alone and crying when she found forever in a cowboy's hands, but she would never be alone again.